I want to recognize our Vice Chair, Professor Odrigajepo of the CDD Governing Board, who is here. Unfortunately, our Executive Director, Professor Kwesi Prempeh, is in Tamale. Actually, he's giving a lecture on reforming campaign financing rules, which I'm sure many of you here will be also interested. But these roundtables are part of our strategic plan to become, even stronger in our thought leadership as CDD, because we think that, what we do, we are purveyors of ideas, and we want to be able to have engagements like this to think through some of the myriad issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So when we get opportunities like this and we see all of you take time to come, we are very, very happy and want to be able to do more of this. Today's topic on feminism on any day will elicit quite a discussion. But fortunately, it is just also coinciding with International Women's Day, which is around the corner on the 8th of March, on a Sunday. So it probably gives us a good opportunity to put these issues in the broader discourse around the world, around women empowerment, equality issues. So I want to say that welcome again. We are hoping to do more this year because of the elections. This is the time that we also engage our political parties in terms of what it is, what kinds of blueprints that they have for development for citizens. And I'm hoping that one of the issues that we probably sometimes, maybe either from a framing point of view, we don't really get a very strong, clear commitment as to what it is that the parties want to do in making our agenda more equal. So maybe it's an opportunity this year to really interrogate those kinds of issues when the manifesto process comes around. And we will be doing a lot of work around that manifesto process because we want to talk more about outcomes, less about outputs, so that we can really track progress. So let me welcome you again, and I look forward to a very interesting discussion. I'll give it back to Jamila.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asante. Now, up next, how many of us know the Afrobarometer report, by show of hands? Okay, they always have some very So I'd like to welcome Josephine Sani, who is the Afrobarometer Communication Coordinator for Anglophone West Africa. And she's going to share some of those insightful snippets from their research so far. Thank you.
hear from about electoral participation. So we have, out of the 275 members of parliament, only 36 of them are women. But it's like a 10 percentage points increase compared to the previous elections, right? And just about 136 of them contested out of the 1,158 people who contested for the parliamentary elections. Now, to the recent district assembly elections, only 909 women contested against, as compared to 17,601 men. And the unit committee elections, we have 3,751 women contesting, as compared to 34,769. So like the women who contested was just like 10% of the men. Okay, my data is ready. So before we get into this, just a little bit about Afrobarometer and what we do. We're a non-partisan research network, and basically what we do is to provide reliable data on Africans' experiences and evaluations of the qualities of life in governance, democracy, economic, social issues, basically everything that concerns the everyday lives of Ghanaians. Our goal mainly is to ensure that the ordinary citizen's voice is considered when we are making important decisions, policy making decisions, right? We surveys, which is expected to be conducted in about 35 African countries. So in every country, we have a national partner that conducts the survey. So CDD-Ghana is the national partner for Afrobarometer. That means that the recent survey that we conducted between September and November 2019 was conducted by CDD-Ghana. We also play the core partner role. That means that we oversee operations in Francophone Africa, North Africa, and Anglophone West Africa. So we provide technical support for the national partners in these countries. So this gives us a snapshot of Afrobarometer's footprints, basically. The gray shaded areas in the middle are the countries that we've not yet conducted any survey at all. So we have, our sample is usually nationally representative, and it's for adult citizens who are age 18 years and above. We go through very stringent methodologies to ensure that every citizen, so in this case, every Ghanaian, had an equal chance of being selected for the survey. So we spoke to 2,400 adult Ghanaians, and that yields a margin of error of plus or minus 2 percentage points at a 95% confidence level. So, political leadership, land, and jobs. So the data I'm going to be sharing with you is basically, I'm combining two sets of data from our around 7-day survey, which was conducted in September 2017, because we had a special module on, but we'll also be sharing some things from our round 8 data, survey which was conducted last year. But we'll also have some over time trends, because we've been doing this for 20 years, so there's some questions that have been repeated over time, so we'll see how these attitudes have changed over time. So, support for women in political leadership. We have about 7 in 10 Ghanaians saying that women should have the same chance to be elected into political office as men. So it's been consistent since 2012, right? But there's still a quarter of Ghanaians who are saying that men make better leaders, and so they rather should always be given the chance to stand for office. So who are those saying that men make better leaders than women? Men are twice as likely to say that they make better leaders as compared to women, right? And it's the same with age. So you realize that the young adults who are aged between 18 and 35 years are almost twice as likely as the elderly who are over 55 years to say that men make better leaders. But when it comes to the perception that women should also be given equal chances, then it's widespread across all the demographics, as you can see. Also, other views on support for women's equality, this time when it comes to like the economic aspect. So we have a very large majority saying that women should have equal right to land, 86%, as compared to 12% who disagree. And then we have close to 6 in 10 saying that it is better if women are given the responsibility to take care of the house and children rather than the men. So we have just like less than 4 in 10 saying that, less than 4 in 10 disagreeing with this statement. And then we have a third of Ghanaians saying that when jobs are scarce, it's better for men to have more rights to these jobs than women. But again, this is opposed by about 6 in 10 Ghanaians who think that both men and women should have the same right to jobs. So women and the uneducated are more likely to say that women should take care of the house. And then when it comes to the perception that men should have more rights to job, it's strongest among men, the uneducated, and rural residents, as compared to women, those who are educated with primary, secondary, and post-secondary education, and urban residents. So the first set of stuff I shared were opinions, whether they should have the rights. But in reality, do Ghanaians think that women have such equal rights? We have large and overwhelming majorities actually agreeing or strongly agreeing that girls have equal rights to get an education. So that's cited by 94% if you add the agree and strongly agree. They also said women have equal rights to earn an income, cited by 92%. Equal rights to get a job, 92%. Equal rights to own land, 86%. So now let's look at the educational gaps. And this is based on the educational status of the people that we interviewed. But like I said, it's nationally representative. So men are twice as likely as women to have post-secondary education. So my colors are not so good, but the orange is the women, and then the yellow, the yellow is the men. So when you see that 18%, 9%, men are twice as likely to have post-secondary education. But the reverse is the case when you look at those with no formal education. Women are almost twice as likely as men to have no formal education. We also did a trend analysis of the lack of formal education. And you realize that consistently, the proportion of women who do not have formal education is always higher than the men, right? But then the gap has only declined marginally. So you realize that it was really wide in 2005, and it's narrowing a bit, but it's even on employment, asset ownership, and financial autonomy. So men are about 10 percentage points more likely than women to have either full-time or part-time employment. So for the men, if you add those who have full-time employment or part-time employment, you get 60%. And then if you add that for women, you get 50%. So there's a 10 percentage point difference. When it comes to asset ownership, women trail the men in all the, ownership of all the ranges of assets, from mobile phones to radios to television to bank accounts to motors, cars to computers. But then the steepest gap is actually with the ownership of bank accounts. So there's a 19 percentage point difference when you compare the proportion of men and women who have bank accounts. And I think the lowest gap is when it comes to mobile phones, which is like a 9 percentage point difference. Deciding how money is used. So we asked them, what is the main way that decisions are made about how to use any money that you earn, for example, from a job, from a business, from selling, And so when you look at the men, the proportion who say they make the decisions themselves is 71%. But the proportion of women who say they make such decisions themselves is 61%. That means that there's a 10 percentage points difference when it comes to having that kind of financial decision-making power, right? Now, only 5% of men said their spouses make those decisions. But 13% of women say they make their spouses make those decisions. So compared to the men, women are like twice as likely to defer such financial decision-making powers to their husbands. Digital gaps. So again, women are less likely than men to own mobile phones, to use mobile phones every day, to say that their mobile phones have access to internet, to use internet regularly, to regularly get news via social media, to regularly get news from internet, or to own computers. That means that there's a digital gap across all the various indicators. Now, since 2017, you realize that the percentage of internet regularly has increased, but so has the gap between men and women. So in 2008, the gap, so with the digital gap, and that's defined by those who use internet every day or a few times in the week. The digital gap was just about 5 percentage points. It's increased now to 17%. So more women are using digital services. The digital gap has still increased. Women's physical safety. So this is from a question we asked in round 7, right? That do you think it's justified to beat your wife? And in Ghana, an overwhelming majority said it is never justified for a man to beat his wife. So we had about 87% saying that it's never justified. When you compare Ghana to the other African countries, you realize that we are among the countries with the least tolerance for wife beating. So it's even far less than the continental average. Ghana is 13%, the continental average is like 28%, so there's like a 50% difference between Ghana's tolerance for wife beating and then the continental average, right? When it comes to fear of violence, it looks like we are all scared. So men and women express similar levels of fear of various forms of violence, from feeling unsafe in the neighborhood, to fearing crime at home, to fearing violence during public protests, to fearing violence in the neighborhood. We are all on the same scale. So now to civic engagement and political participation. When it comes to voting, so we asked them if they voted in the 2016 elections, and women were equally as likely as men to say they voted in the previous elections. But it looks like that's the only thing that they have in equal with the men. They lag behind men in all the other forms of political and civic engagement. From discussion of politics, you realize that there is like an 11 percentage point difference between men and women. Attending a community meeting, still 11 percentage point difference. Joining others to raise an issue, still the women lag behind. Attending a protest or demonstration march, the women are always lagging behind, except with voting. So we did a trend analysis of the discussion of politics, and we realized that since 1999, women have consistently expressed less interest than men in politics. The question we ask is that when you get together with friends or family, would you say you discuss political matters frequently, occasionally, and never, right? And realize that women have less interest in discussing politics with their friends and families. Except in 2002, I'm not sure what happened in 2002, but they all seem to be at par then. But when it comes to access in public services, there is a reverse of the trends that we've seen. We asked if they had to pay bribes or offer some sort of favor or gifts before they could access basic public services. And we realized that men were more likely than women to say that they had to pay bribes before they could obtain services. That means that women got the services without necessarily having to pay bribes. And also when it comes to the ease of access to public services, women were more likely to report ease of access to basic public services than men. That means that men found it more difficult to access public services than women. So in a nutshell, women in political leadership, we have 7 in 10 Ghanaians saying that they want women to have the same chance as men to be elected in power. But remember, there's still a quarter of Ghanaians who think men make better leaders. When it comes to educational gaps, women are twice as likely as men to lack formal education, but it's the reverse when we are talking about post-secondary education. And then in terms of financial autonomy, men are 10 percentage points more likely than women to say that they make decisions themselves about how the household money is spent. Women are more likely to defer such responsibilities to their spouses. And then there's been a widening digital gap between men and women, even though the women's regular use of internet is also increasing. So, thank you.
Shared. I noticed that we all seemed a little apprehensive when she talked about the violence. It was very clear that there was a shift going on in the room. So I thought that was also interesting that it's balanced in that way. Also interesting is the fact that the majority of Ghanaians do not believe that men should be beating their wives. Although my question there is it just that one, or are we talking about gender-based violence in general? So to kind of unpack some of this, we have a panel of resource who are going to help us, and I'm going to introduce them. They're all very well accomplished and all have very interesting perspectives on the topic. So to start off, I would like to invite Professor Audrey Gajakpo to take her seat. She has over 20 years of experience, in teaching, research, and feminist advocacy. And she's also done considerable work in the media space. So we're going to be hearing some of her thoughts with regards to narratives around feminism in Ghana. Up next, we have Kobina Ankoma Graham, who is a lecturer at Webster University. He's also a writer and a DJ, and a self-proclaimed feminist, right? And then our final panelist is Dr. Ama Opoku-Agyeman, who is a pharmacist by training, a teacher by calling, and a researcher by choice. Great, I'll be joining them as well.
As people who believe in women's empowerment. And so you know, if you look at it that way, I don't see why people are so afraid of being called feminists, particularly in, in countries like Ghana, where when you call people a feminist, they're like, no, somebody obviously to me fits the definition of a feminist. They believe in women's empowerment, they're advocating for it, they're doing all of those things that we think feminists should do. But when you define her as a feminist, she will say, no, I'm not a feminist. And maybe we need to put that on the table.
For me, I've always kind of defined feminism maybe in two ways, depending on who I'm speaking to. When I'm speaking to a class full of my students, I make it a point to say that I'm a feminist, particularly for the boys in the class to hear and to be able to see that it is possible for someone to be a man and hold feminist viewpoints. And then in other spaces, I might wait to be told that I'm a feminist based on what I say or do, rather than asserting that I'm a feminist. But for me personally, I think it's about somebody who acknowledges a difference in or a lack of equality when it comes to gender, and who acts on that and tries to get rid of that inequality. Yeah.
Okay, so unlike Prof, I don't teach feminism. All my academic is pharmacy stuff. So my definitions of feminism is how I see it, nothing academic on what I've studied. But I believe feminism to be the equality of the sexes. So a doctrine, an acknowledgement, anything that believes that men and women are equal, despite the differences they have. Because there's always this thing of, but you are not the same. How can you be equal? You are not the same. You are not like a man. So we are not same, but we are equal. We need, and we should have equal access to opportunities. We should be treated equally. So I think that conversation of equality is what pushes a lot of people out, because then they are thinking, I talked to a student once, a male student, who was telling me, oh, but you are not as strong as me. And if I had to pound fufu, I'll be the one to do it. I'm like, no, let's not go there. That's not the conversation. There's nothing about us being there, because obviously, physically, we are different. But equality, just being human, it's enough for that basis of equality. So I think for me, that's how I define feminism and how I try to live my life on that basis.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, great. So thank you all for sharing. I think that we do have some commonality, but also a lot of nuance. And I think that's something that's usually missing, right? When people get up and start having conversations about feminism, most times we're probably not coming from the same perspective. And so already that sets the tone for a lot of confusion. So I guess for a working definition for us, we can talk about equality across social, economic, political lines, and then anyone who believes in women's empowerment. Is that fine? Awesome. Now for those of us who are here, of course, you're welcome to join the conversation. It's not just happening here, it's also happening live on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtags are CDD-RTDS, CDD-RTDS, and the second hashtag is each for equal, each for equal. So feel free to share your impressions, and if you're watching online, please also share your impressions and your questions when we do come to Q&A so that we can feed in your questions to our awesome panelists. Now, getting right into the meat of it all. We were having a discussion earlier about new wave feminism and old wave feminism, and supposedly there are all these different waves of feminism. Do you think that is the case? And have you seen any changes between maybe the feminism of 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and what we see today? So Professor Gajepo, would you like to start with that?
the short answer is there's not much difference. I think it's the spaces where people who are doing the kind of work that we will define as broadly as feminist work, pushing for equality, changing the status quo, empowering women, the spaces in which they tend to operate. I think that in the past, there were certain battles that necessarily had to be fought. There were basic battles. I mean, not in Ghana, but in other countries, it was the vote, for example. In other places, it's the right to even go to school. I mean, so there were all of these battles to be fought and won. And today, that's changed a little bit, although Afrobarometer is suggesting that it hasn't changed that drastically. However, there were those basic battles, that the idea that a woman would run for political office was something that people did not accept. Then also, I think that, again, particularly in our part of the world, a lot of work was done at the grassroots. So the old, in quotes, feminist movements were very keen also on engaging women and working with people at the grassroots level. I'm not so sure that younger feminists are doing that kind of work. It's likely that younger feminists are more engaged in spaces like social media, because social media is so important, and are fighting battles in the context in where they perhaps work, in the workplaces and that sort of thing, I think. I mean, so has it changed? Has the nature of feminism changed? I'm not so sure. I just think that the issues may be different and the spaces where people are working may be different.
Okay, thank you. Amma, would you like to share your insights on that?
No, so just when Prof was talking, so this just occurred to me. So for IC, I mean, I wasn't around maybe 40 years ago, so I'm not sure what happened then. But I know for now, then, if I'm wrong, Prof, just people who would call themselves feminists or who were working in the women empowerment spaces, this was their job. This was what they did. But for now, I think, I mean, I don't call myself, I'm a pharmacist, I teach, but I call myself a feminist. I do gender advocacy without necessarily having to go to the grassroots. Whereas, for instance, for some, maybe a few years ago, the person would have to be some economist somewhere who was dealing with women in their businesses, or a lawyer somewhere who was thinking about sexual violence with women. This is how I see. But in our day, it's easier for everybody, no matter your profession, what you do, students, anybody, you call yourself a feminist or a gender advocate, because you have tools available to you like social media to use, and you don't necessarily have to go to the grassroots. I think this is a difference I see. Yeah.
So a bit of a democratization of who gets to call themselves a feminist. Okay, Kobe, I know that you come from a context where you worked and lived with a feminist, self-proclaimed. So can you touch a bit on that? Did you see any changes between what your late mother, God rest her soul, was working with back then and what is being dealt with today?
So just in terms of context, my late mother was Efwa Dokenu, who she primarily campaigned against female genital mutilation and for women's empowerment in general, women and girls. And so I think if I am to remember conversations that I've had with my mother, one of the things that she would pick up on is the fact that at a point in time, it was okay to say feminist. It was something that people were fighting for in terms of feminism. People were fighting for feminism, establishing what it is. But then at a certain point in time, she noticed that she would encounter people who feel a certain shame, especially, and she'd say this for when she would come to Ghana, as opposed to maybe other spaces, because she was primarily based in the UK. So that's something. And I think we also had a conversation at one point in time about girl power, and this very kind of Spice Girls, girl power, empowerment in that way, but then is that really empowering of particular individuals, or is it empowering of entire groups? So she drew some kind of distinctions there. She was a little bit wary of kind of corporate kind of branded feminism, as opposed to a lot of the grassroots work that was being done on the ground by people who may not necessarily even describe what they're doing as feminism. They were just doing the work. And I think for most of her career, she spent her time trying as much as possible to amplify the voices of women who were doing the work on the ground against FGM, against other harmful practices. Yeah.
I think that's definitely an interesting point, and it's also a narrative that you see, or a debate that you see online, about whether Beyonce's type of feminism is actually feminism or not. This corporation-led girls' empowerment movement. But I'm curious about those of us in the room. So just by show of hands, how many of us identify as a feminist? Okay. Okay, so maybe like a third, barely half, and then how many of us don't identify as a feminist at all? And that's fine too. You can raise your hand. Okay. And how many of us are midway? Like, depending on who we are talking to, depending... So depending on who we're talking to, we might identify or not. And the reason I'm asking this question, especially this last question about midway, is because it's something I have dealt with myself, right? I have been in contexts where people will come up to me and say, "You are a feminist," and then just start rattling things off. And so now what I do is, when you come up to me and you start talking about feminism, I will always call you back and say, "What do you mean by feminist?" Right? Because people have very specific ideas about who a feminist is, and context-wise, if you take it out of the context, it can go anywhere. So that's why I kind of introduced that question of, are we on the same page with regards to who a feminist is? If so, then yes, let's continue that conversation. So I'm not surprised to see a few people here also talking about the context element. Moving ahead, if you were to rate Ghana, this one is a lot of work. If you were to rate Ghana's progress so far towards achieving gender equality on a scale of 1 to 100, 100 being excellent, where would you rate Ghana? Do you need a moment? It's to all of you, actually. Whoever is ready to rate Ghana can go ahead.
Are you a hard grader or a kind of lecturer?
I'm a kind of lecturer, but maybe a harder human. Yeah. I find it very hard to put a number on it, because I feel like there's a disparity between where we as a people think that we are and where we actually are. And so, off the top of my head, I'm tempted to say 50. But I feel like I don't know enough of the history to be able to comparatively say it was like this at some point in time and it's like this now. I feel like I'm incredibly unqualified to say. Yeah.
Professor Gajipo.
It's difficult, not because I don't know the history, but because on certain things we seem to be doing very well. I mean, we just saw Afrobarometer that says that when you compare us, we have good attitudes towards domestic violence, against, no, wife beating. It's not just wife beating.
Beaten specifically, yes.
And even though if you're cynical, you say, does that translate into how people really behave? It is a good sign, because it's likely that people will not support wife beating, and anecdotally, you see that people will not admit to, will not support wife beating. I'm at the University of Ghana, and last year's intake had slightly more female students than male students. So we broke the 50% plus barrier in terms of intake. So there's progress in those areas. But we see shocking lack of progress in the political space. And I really think that we need to talk about that. Josephine gave us some numbers that were not necessarily Afrobarometer numbers. And we also saw some from Afrobarometer. And that's why it's difficult to give a grade. We fail abysmally in certain areas, and we do surprisingly well in other areas.
Thank you. Amma?
I don't think there's much to add to what Prof said.
You agree with that?
100%, yeah.
Okay, great. But that's a good segue, because the question about women in politics, and specifically in political leadership, I feel like last year, that was the year that this question resurfaced, thanks to our dear president. And apart from the numbers that Afrobarometer put forth, I'd actually done a Twitter poll during this conversation. About 360 people took that poll. And the question was, do you think Ghana is ready for a female president in the next 5 to 10 years? And 60% said yes, ready for a female president. But of that, it was a split. So 30 said next 5 to 10 years, and then 30 said it will take over 20 years. So overall, there seems to be a consensus on the fact that, like, women can take on political leadership. But as we saw from the conversation that the president kind of catalyzed, is also a question of what are the realities on the ground when it comes to working in a political landscape, specifically in Ghana's political landscape. So would you like to touch a bit on that, Professor Gajibo, since you already brought that up? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I mean, it's something that we've thought about for a long time. And for me, it boils down to the kind of political environment that is created for elective politics. When it comes to appointments, you see that certain administrations, certain people, even the current government tries, you know? They're not afraid to have women as ministers. They're not afraid to have women as deputy ministers, on boards. The percentage is not that great. Women, we've had women in the top judiciary job and all of that. But when it comes to elective politics, something happens. And I think it's the nature of our politics, the acrimonious, toxic nature of politics, and also the patronage system that characterizes politics here. And that's why you don't get women either contesting, or when they do contest, they don't go far. And I know that because I've talked to a few women politicians, and when you're socialized, as we all are, as women in a patriarchal society like Ghana, nice women don't get embroiled in certain things, in quotes. And therefore, if you're a woman in politics and you are out there and we have uncivil political discourses where people are tearing at each other, and you go toe to toe, then you're not a very nice woman, you know? And then you get called names. I've had women politicians who have told me, my mother says, no, my people are begging me, don't go into that fray. It's not dignifying of you. We know you're better than that. I had a long, long time ago, a politician, a female politician telling me that even when you campaign, the time you have to campaign and do the kinds of things you need to do to get ahead, is not friendly towards women. And if you don't have a very supportive husband, for example, if you're a married woman, you do get into trouble. So I think it's the nature of competitive politics that makes it very inhospitable for women.
I feel like you just broke it all down. So, so if there's anyone in the room who has a question, start thinking about your questions. I'm going to allow Kobe and Amma to respond, and then after that, we'll take questions from the audience. If you're watching online as well, you can send in your questions with the hashtag CDDRTDS.
I had a favorite anecdote that I said, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm hogging the space, but an anecdote that I said I would share in this conversation that I sort of forgot, that had to do with politics, is even the people in parliament who should know better, our political leaders, are very hostile towards women or demean women in the space of the chamber. I repeat, in the space of the chamber. And we only have to think back to placards being held when already we have only about 10% or less women in our parliament, and when we had a by-election and a woman joined parliament, placards calling her a bloody widow. And that took me back to vetting. And again, this was in the past because I wrote a column about it. We had a brilliant scientist, Dr. Christina Mwakunyama. She was being vetted as Minister for the Environment, which is very progressive, right? Well, what questions did they ask her, and what questions were reported in the media? So you had promised will come later on to the media. It was somebody asking her, hey, how do you keep yourself to look like a 16-year-old? That's all that got reported about an accomplished woman vying for an important position as Minister for Environment.
Amma,
Yeah, so
you have
just,
something to say?
yeah, as another example was, I think a few years ago when Ekufo, I forget her first name, the Attorney General now, also, Sophia, also at her vet, and she was being asked, Gloria, so she was also asked questions about concubines, and this was what was reported, her kids, and she had to, why she wore anklets, and she had to spend time talking about this. So yeah, I think it's just it's hostile to women, and it takes a certain kind of woman who wants to just forget about everything and move on to do it. If the society, you are concerned in any way about what society thinks of you, you just back down and keep your sanity, I think.
So, okay, so what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of perception and framing which might potentially influence a woman who's considering political office or otherwise. Professor Gajibo brought up the media element, so let's just dive right into that. Amma, would you like to share, what are you seeing online these days when it comes to feminists and gender advocates who are outspoken online in the Ghana digital sphere? What are some of the opportunities? Because I do think there might be some there. What are some of the challenges and maybe some trends that you've noticed?
I mean, for opportunities, I think the biggest one is you have the opportunity to make yourself known. I mean, you write one post about feminism and people will learn. There are people who send me a lot of inbox messages. I think last year, during the Legon infamous sexual harassment issue, the BBC were great. I made a lot of posts about sexual harassment, and I got a lot of messages from guys who actually wanted to meet with me. So I tell them exactly what sexual harassment is. Because they realized they were doing certain things that they thought was okay. And now I am saying that this could be sexual harassment. And I found that very progressive. I mean, I saw some of them, I don't know, maybe they just wanted to. But for most people, I think they were being honest. And I had conversations with a few people. And I was like, oh, really? So that's a sexual harassment. Oh, anyway. So for me, that's the biggest opportunity to get to educate people. And as much as you are having a lot of backlash and attack and vitriol from people, there are people who are also listening. They might not get back to you many, many times. And in the last few years that I've done a lot of social media advocacy, I've at least portrayed myself as feminist. Many people come to me and say that, oh, I can also say I'm a feminist now. It's not a bad thing after all. I mean, I get it now. So there's that good thing. And of course, there's the backlash. Like, how is your husband coping? Are you sure you're giving him sex? You know, all the nonsense you get. Your marriage is not going to last because... So there's all that, and every once in a while you think, is this worth it? Shall I just go to my classroom and teach my students and just keep it down? I mean, I'm a feminist. I don't have to do it online.
So why do you continue? I guess that's
a good question. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, I'll come back to you. You can think a bit about that. Kobe, you've also been in the social media space for a very long time, and you've seen probably some of the changes that the Ghana social media space has gone through. What are you seeing in that respect? And this question of sexual harassment, online bullying, and what women can and cannot talk about online.
I think one of the things that has been encouraging to see, because I think around the time that I joined Twitter, there weren't that many Ghanaians on Twitter. You type in hashtag Ghana, and most of what you were getting were reports from places like CDD. You weren't getting people talking. And I think that's the main thing that has changed now. People are talking more, and people are talking to the extent that you have... We were talking earlier about the fact that not everybody's definitions of feminism are the same. I think from like an observer viewpoint, it seems like there are more people having discussions around issues without even necessarily saying feminism. The issues are coming up. People's different viewpoints on them are coming up. Even amongst people who actually come out and say, I'm feminist, you're finding that there are differences. Of course, there's this kind of thing that people do where they knock feminism simply because feminists don't seem to agree online, which is quite nonsensical when you think about, I don't know, if you think about any religion in this country, there are like how many hundred different types of churches, for example, and some of them actually disagree with each other on particular things, but they agree on other things. And I think feminism is a broad church in that regard. And so people often, simply off the fact that there's disagreement online, they say, I'm dismissing the whole thing. But then I would say smarter people stick with it and they get to know what the nuances are and where they fall within those nuances. So I think there's just a lot more conversation that's happening now. And I think that's the most promising thing that I see. And then I guess also from speaking as a man, there are also more young men I know who are engaging with it, some in very cynical ways. And so there are some people who literally would put the tag feminist in their bio almost as a way of trolling. So they're actually, it's almost like they want you to engage with them in order for them to show you the extent to which they're not feminist. And then there are people online who think that they're feminist, but then maybe not. Maybe some way to go. So it's a very mixed bag, especially in this very crazy digital space.
I mean, I think I can also agree with some of what you said. A lot of the times I see that, or at least from my experience, I speak from my experience, when having conversations with people on whether it's the economy or governance, things that people consider to be, in quotes, hard topics, once they don't actually have a credible argument, the way they end the conversation is, oh, but you are a feminist, so, right? So feminism also, being a feminist has also become like an excuse that people use to exit conversations where they might not actually have the information. And unfortunately, I think that also stops a lot of very useful conversations right? Because if we had, like with the case of the guys who are asking you about sexual harassment, that is a starting point for actually addressing issues around gender-based violence, which are core to women's rights and human rights in general, since it doesn't just happen to women and girls, although they're the majority. So yeah, I definitely see those elements as well. You want to say something else? Okay, go ahead.
If I could just add to that, there are also pockets where you are seeing young men who are quietly educating themselves about what is going on, perspectives that they were not aware of. And I think it's worth adding that too. So not everybody on there is there in a cynical fashion. There is some progress that is actually going on online as well in that regard.
We'll be talking about male allies soon. So, Professor Gajibo.
Well, I think that there are a couple of people in this room who belong to the online feminist group, Pepperdam Ministries. And I think that they'll have interesting perspectives, or you belong to it, about some of the pushback that you get and some of the abuse that you get on that. But because you've done so well in answering questions on about social media, I wanted to just rope in the traditional media.
Yes, exactly.
And to talk about the fact that the traditional media is still sometimes quite disappointing in showing that there's been progress. I'm on a WhatsApp group with female journalists, and just yesterday somebody posted a video that was making the social media rounds, but it was an ad. And it was an ad of a woman with her back turned to the camera, obviously, and hooking, just the top, and hooking her bra at the back. And it was an ad for Swift. And the tagline was, when she found out he had a Swift, right? Yes. Yes. So, look, just imagine the implication. So when the woman found out that he had a Swift, she started to what? Undress. But the good thing about that was, so somebody posted it and wanted to know how people felt. Of course, everybody condemned it and recognized that sexist. And then there were questions as to what to do. And they thought, talking about the old feminist movement and new feminist movement, they thought, somebody posted, what are the feminist movement doing about this? And I'm like, why do you think they have to do something about it? How about us? And immediately somebody called the advertising agency and engaged them, and they apologized and promised to pull the advert. It was really, in 2 hours, it had been addressed, and I was very, very impressed. But it was an interesting conversation. One, it showed me that, the old, I was just shocked to see an ad like that. I thought we had gone beyond the silliness in this place. But it tells us that these sexualized objectification of women, sexualization, persist, but also to think that people are considered as feminists thought it was somebody else's job. And then the third good news was that, but when they did take action, something happened. Something good happened.
Great. So we've had a lot of talk up here. I'm sure there are some people out there who have things to say. So we're going to take a first round of questions and contributions. Great.
Working class or lower income earning women, sexual minorities, sex workers, religious minorities, and everyone that comes under that group. I want your perspectives on the extent to which mainstream feminism in Ghana has embraced these groups, and if it's not satisfactory, what you think can help them to be part of the discussion or to be centered. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question here. Can you raise your hand so she can see it?
And then put up my hand again when you ask who is in between those two categories. The reason being that I'm very weary of putting labels on myself, especially when it comes to the fight for women's rights and women equality, because we know that the word feminism evokes so much confusion, anger, and antagonistic behavior from Ghanaians. And for me, I feel that what can we do as women or people who are interested in improving the lives of women generally do to deconstruct what it means to be a feminist, for people to understand that, look, it's not a matter of men versus women. In the long run, it's not a matter of men versus women. It's a matter of social justice. It's a matter of what is not right that should be done to other people, and in this case, is women. So maybe we should find new approaches, especially a local way of translating what it means to be a feminist, or what it means to be fighting for gender equality, in order for people to understand that we are not being antagonistic or whatever misconceptions that they might have about what it means to be a feminist.
Any other questions?
More men in the space. And so people think that when you say gender equality, you are talking about women, basically. And so that is why you find more women leading the campaign. How about getting the men to, I'm glad that I have Kobe here saying he's a feminist. If we have more men probably leading that, men as well as women will understand that we are trying to just correct an imbalance in our society and not about women.
Sure. I'll take a final question.
I just want to comment on the fact that now people on social media are also being more sensitive towards the kind of things they post online. So they write maybe a sexist comment and they say something like, I don't want the feminists to come for my head. And so I think that we are making progress online, but also we'll have to be more conscious as feminists on how we continuously engage these kind of people, because a lot of them, they are beginning to realize that this is wrong, but I'm not there yet. So they just put it out there and they get people's comments on that. Also, I feel a lot of people are still struggling to identify themselves as feminists, because there are also the levels of feminism. Because I've heard people say I'm a radical feminist, and so you find these people really subscribing to really strong, allies that do not really support the norms or the practices, though we are all trying to challenge the status quo, which is very good. But a lot of these people also find themselves really at the top. And so people use them as the, I don't know the word to use, but people measure feminism against their level. And so the others who subscribe to feminism just for gender equality, gender equity, they find it difficult to come out as feminists because they are not there yet. And so when you find maybe online struggles between these feminists and those at the top, then there's some kind of battle or some kind of conversations or misunderstanding between these groups of feminists, because now you are not there yet, so they don't identify you as a feminist. But it's also a process, because some of us had to really learn to become feminists. And so we need to give people the opportunity to also get there. Thank you.
Great. So we'll do another. embracing minority feminist groups, right? So whoever wants to take that question. What can we do to deconstruct feminism and help people understand? And specifically, can we come up with new local approaches to that process of understanding? I think that's partly what you also touched on. The question of male allies and male gender advocates, how visible and active are they, and how can we get them more involved? And the question of people being sensitive, more sensitive about what they're posting online. Are we in a rush to make people feminists as opposed to understanding that it's a process, and how can we all contribute to that process? So those are 4 questions. You're welcome to address any of them that you feel more geared at. I'm going to read 1 or 2. It's nice to hear my voice. Okay, so I'm just going to read first names. So if you're watching on Facebook, sorry, I'm not going to massacre your last name. Okay, so Poli said, great ideas being shared. Right Royal Ni says, what are we going to do about women who willingly do not want to come into politics because of the name calling? I think sometimes men come out as better personalities to be in politics because they've grown a certain tough skin when it comes to dealing with that. Marissa says, even though they're talking about parity in politics, there's a lot of work that remains to be done to overcome patriarchal obstacles. Ifwa says, Kobe makes a good point about pseudo-feminists and trolls. Okay, Ni has a lot to say. Change begins from the mind. It's not saying that we're not making progress, but let's not forget the cultural limitations as well. Okay, he says a lot, basically. So thank you, guys. If you still have questions or comments, the hashtag is CDD-RTDS. And now we're going back to our panel for their responses. Kobe, go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to talk to 2 questions, if possible. First off, with regards to local approaches and making it more relevant locally, I think it's about shining a light on what is already happening. Number one, I feel like there are groups like AWDF, etc., who, and in fact, many groups that are working with people on the ground in areas way outside of the cities, all across the continent, and they're working hand in hand with people who are on the ground doing the work. And that work is not just work that started now, it's also historical. And so if there was a way of putting the spotlight on that, because major conversation that I used to have with my mother about this was, my mom always used to talk about the suffragette movement being like ground zero for, let's say, Western feminism. And so she says, when I put it to her that she's like, where does your interest in FGM come from? She said that one of the reasons why she chose to engage in the anti-FGM struggle is because she really thought of it as Africa's ground zero. She felt that it was really the beginnings of an indigenous women's movement. And that's why she thought, in the face of going into meetings where she'd find people who would be claiming that they were the people who eradicated FGM in this village, ignoring the work of the women on the ground, she made it her job to be the voice for those African women on the ground in the big meetings that those women will never have access to. And so it's really about shining the light on not just what is already being done, but what has historically been done at that level. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is to do with men, and where are the men? I think one of the ways in which I don't hear this framed a lot is, when I think about it, I think that Ghana has a marriage crisis that people don't spend a lot of time talking about. If you look at the previous census and the one before that, it looks like we have a rising divorce rate. And there are certain things that it is ascribed to, or a particular gender that it is ascribed to, usually. And I think that is not the problem. I think what has happened, if I'm to put it in simpler terms, is we now have a few generations of women who have received formal education, and so they are now competing with men for work and for salaries, and it's just really changed the game in terms of what people, what access women have resources to, in terms of things that certain classes and types of women can tolerate and not tolerate in the home before they say, you know what, I've had enough, I'm leaving. Or with some girls, it's like, am I even going to marry in the first place? And I think what hasn't happened is raising a generation of boys who understand that and are not threatened by that. But everyone seems to put the emphasis on women to say, so it's like we should educate our girls so that they can be empowered and stand up, but then at the same time they need to learn how to be humble and kneel. So it's like you're kneeling and you're standing up at the same time. I can see how that would be confusing, you see. Whereas the simple solution is that our boys need to be socialized to be okay with certain things. And so as men, we need to be able to step into the kitchen without a problem, to look after our own children. Those are the kinds of socialization changes that need to happen. And it's not just about saying it. That means your son needs to learn how to go to the market. You see, you need to think about things like that, because after a certain point they'll get there and they won't be able to do those things. Once we solve that, we might solve the marriage crisis. And if we solve the marriage crisis, we save our society as a whole. And that's a problem for men and women alike. Yeah.
But can I just add a little something? Last point before. And to say that also to teach and socialize boys and men in a different manner. Not only to cook and go to the market and stuff like that, but to understand what it means and does not mean to be a man or a woman. And therefore, because he's talking in terms of marriage, should not assume that because you are male, you should command more salary than the female in the household. And things like that. There's a lot of little things that have to change and assumptions that have to change, so that when somebody comes in the door, well, we're about to have a census this year, they'll say, who is the head of the household? Well, who is the head of the household? You know, I mean, and so, but structurally in our society, it's structured in that way. They want, you know, they can't have to, you know. So there are all kinds of things that have to change. But my more, so that goes into my point. I'm not sure which one to answer first. Maybe I'll deal with the one about feminism. And it's true, it's a label, in a certain sense, that comes with, it evokes certain things in people's minds, and depending on who hears it, you know, some people it's like waving a red piece of cloth before a bull, you know, it triggers, you know, a certain reaction, you know. And that's why my submission was that we should simplify what it means. And I really like Kobe saying it's like, it's a broad a church, you know. There are different kinds, there are different variants. And I think that sometimes when you become too judgmental and say somebody is not feminist enough, it becomes a problem. And so, yes, I think part of the problem may be that people perceive certain acts as acts typical of feminists, but against our cultural norms. Although, again, that one we can contest. What are our cultural norms? You know? So feminism has always come with its own baggage. The term feminism has always come with its own baggage. But my attitude to it is that embrace it and if more people embrace it and explain it and show it and act in ways that make people get it, that feminism is not about, I don't know, lesbianism, but feminism is about wanting equality, changing the status quo, having women empowered, it will be good. Then the other thing I want to address is the intersectionalities. That is really a very important question. I think that there's a lot of engagement going on all of the time with different people, with different women's movements. There are women's movements like NetRight, that is a network organization with all kinds of membership from the grassroots up. That I'm a member of NetRight, and all of that. And they all believe in the same thing, and they all connect in different ways. So it doesn't have to be this segregated thing that says some people are this kind of feminist on this level and this kind of feminist on the other level. And then when it comes to, and then there's the Domestic Violence Coalition. There are already men who are active in that space. I mean, the convener of the Domestic Violence Coalition, is that what we call it? That actually, in the end, Adolf was a convener when the bill was actually passed, right? It was a guy, So there are lots of men, perhaps not enough, but there are lots of men that are engaged in the struggle, so to speak. And there is the controversial he for she movement. Yeah, so there's he for she, and I'm not sure what they do, but there's he for she, And then also, finally, the issues that have to be worked on, If you mentioned how do you engage with issues like prostitution. I mean, those are social justice issues that if you're a feminist, actually, I think, your starting point is social justice and equality. And because of your own experience engaged in that kind of struggle, you ought to be sensitive to other struggles, including struggles of homosexuality or sexuality, people's identities, exploitation, human trafficking, prostitution, and understand people and not impose necessarily your values and views on people. That's what I think.
Okay, Amma.
Yeah.
What are you addressing?
So the issue of the sexual minorities and radical feminists and non-radical feminists.
Okay, great.
So, and for me, on my feminism journey, I always realize my privilege when it comes to other issues. Like when it comes to homosexuality, then you suddenly realize, oh, being a heterosexual is a privilege. The same way you're thinking men are privileged. So I think for most people, the difficulties, they don't recognize their privilege. Just because I'm a woman and I'm being discriminated against, they feel I'm at the bottom and nobody else is beyond you. But we all know. Just today in my office, one of my professors came to me and said, can you imagine the LGBTQ people are coming to have a conference? I'm like, what's the problem with that? It's freedom of association. They are not going to have sex at the conference place. You go for your conference. So, I mean, I engaged him on that. He wasn't happy, and I'm not sure where we'll go from there. But so that's the point. We as feminists, sometimes we suddenly forget the privilege, also, even we have, to even be in spaces to be able to talk about these things. So I always talk about how you'd always have to sit back. If somebody's telling you about their discrimination, the things they are going through, you don't just dismiss it and say, this is not an issue. Yours is an issue. You're telling men, sit down and listen to our issues. Other people, sit down and listen to our issues in the same way. So I think, and I agree, it's also a learning process for a lot of people. Many people, they just can't get their head around homosexuality and sexual minorities. So yeah, we'll get there. On the radical feminism issue, and Kobe makes a good point when he talks about the church. I have this example I use. When it comes to football, I've never seen people who are so, when it comes to football and our teams and Liverpool and Barca, and people But we never say football is a bad game. We support our teams, we troll each other, we say all sorts of things. When it comes to feminism, it's suddenly do it my way or it's no way at all. And I think that's problematic. What is feminism? So far as you understand what it is and you identify with it. However somebody else is approaching it, so far as I think it's not defeating the bigger purpose, I don't think that should be the big deal. So much that somebody is saying this and somebody is saying that and suddenly I'll dismiss feminism. And this is always the angle I go from. What do you actually believe in? What do you actually believe that men and women are equal? And that you should have equal access to opportunities? That is the bigger point. All the rest are just tangentials. We like to debate and scream ourselves hoarse over and lose the bigger argument.
Like an hour-long conversation, our Senegalese counterparts were quiet. They didn't say anything. And at a point, we noticed that. We're like, wait, what do you think about this? Because in their context at that time, this was in 2008, female genital mutilation was a big issue, right? So we finally said, what do you think about it? And one lady stood up and said, you know, I understand what you guys are talking about and how it might look from the outside. But in the context I come from, if a girl does not go through this, in quotes, rite of passage, then it means that she's going to be excluded from society. She's going to be ostracized. She won't be able to get a job because people will say she's unclean. She won't be able to get married, meaning she'll not even be able to build her own small society, and it affects everything else. So at the end of the day, for many of us, it's a question of where is the higher cost? And we will be willing to suffer this just to be included. And for me, like, I always go back to that story because, like you said, it gives you pause. Like, you're coming from a very specific perspective, but unless you understand the context, which is why I always like to crouch, what are we talking about? What's the context here? You might be totally off. They didn't say that they don't want to, like, stop FGM. They said that the choices that we are presented with make it difficult for us to say, just right now, today, let's end it. And that comes to my definition of, like, whether it's women's empowerment or feminism. At the end of the day, it's about expanding choices for women and girls. I feel like if we're able to create the right environment, give them the right tools, give them the right support, empower them to make the choices that are best for them, whether that is being in a corporate office or being at home or working in the community or not even caring about national affairs, that is her choice. And yeah, I just thought I would share that because I feel like we touch on a lot of these things, and that is kind of an example also of the intersectional feminism. And things are blowing up on Facebook. So I don't even know which of these to read. Let me just look through real. Okay, someone says, Erasy says, I don't believe there are levels of feminism. You either are or you're not. What the difference is our individual personalities. Kobe makes a fantastic points about the marriage crisis and matters arising around how boys are raised. And yes, I am with you 100% on the socialization of boys because there is a mismatch, and that mismatch is going to continue. Because, like you said, you can't expect people to be standing and sitting at the same time, especially when the other side isn't really, they're just sitting, right? Okay. Another point about feminists judging others as not feminist enough. Rashida said that, yes, that is a very important point. This question about household chores. I don't understand why Ghanaians are so obsessed, I would think, about, right? In Nigeria. So this is someone talking about East Africa and household chores and what do we think about that? Is feminism just about who gets to be in the kitchen or not? And that question of roles as well. So I'm mentioning all these because we will do a final wrap up, but I'm gonna go back to the audience for 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll do a wrap-up, and you can touch on some of these things in your wrap-up. Yes, we have a question right up front here.
Yes, 3 walks, trying to educate people and also to appeal to the government to pass the bill. And throughout our engagement with people, we've realized that very little women actually come out willingly to participate in most of the walks or the advocacy. So now my question is, and you know, we can't talk about, I am a feminist, and I believe that for us feminists, it is important for us to also make sure that the affirmative action bill is passed. So I want to know for other feminists, why is it difficult for us to participate or to come together to push this particular agenda? And is it an issue of not believing in the act? And if that is the case, what can we do differently? And also, I would also want to know, how do we get all of us to participate? And the issue of the media, I don't know, but maybe I might be wrong, but I feel like almost all women or educated women who understand the concept of feminism and women of gender equality should be pushing for this particular agenda. So I want to know, I see very little female media personalities actually using their platforms to push this agenda. What are we doing wrong? How can we get everyone on board? If all 50% of women, more than 50% of the Ghanaian population comes out to say that we want this action, this affirmative action bill passed, can the government refuse it? Okay. So what are we doing wrong?
Great
Thank you.
question. Another question. Okay, there's one here, and then, wait, is there anybody else apart from her who hasn't spoken yet? We need to be a bit inclusive. Okay, no. So once you're done, then we'll take a final question.
Okay, so mine is more of a contribution.
Okay, please keep it to 30 seconds.
I'm a daughter of a pastor. And when my mom first heard that I'm pushing for the passage of the affirmative action bill, somebody actually went on my Facebook, took my bio, sent to her that your daughter says she's a feminist. The first thing my mom said was, you need to come home immediately. I've called the moderator of the Global Evangelical Church. We need to go deliver you. You're possessed. Yes. You're possessed. For me, that is the general mindset of Ghanaians. Once they think you're a feminist, once they think you're a gender advocate, you're a devil. And so people don't want to have anything to do with you. People think, oh, look at her coming. She sleeps with women, she does this, she does that, she does that. But the major problem that I have found out is about awareness creation and sensitization. How many of the people we deal with daily are on our social media pages? We go to the market to buy from women. These women see you on TV talking about affirmative action, talking about gender, talking about women empowerment and all that. They don't understand what you're talking about. What you're talking about is so foreign to them. What are we in our little ways doing to get down to this market whip and explain the concept of gender equality to them? You remembered when we had the first walk to the Jubilee House.
You have 10 more seconds.
An educated security officer, policeman actually, walked towards us at Circle and said, what are you people doing? We said, we are embarking on the work. He said, oh, you people are the ones looking for husbands. So you're marching to the Jubilee House for the president to give you husbands. I think feminists in Ghana have a long way to go, and we have a lot to do. Unfortunately, we are busy fighting
I'm going to
ourselves.
use my powers now. So thank you very much. Can we give a round of applause for sharing that story? And so one clear question And then I'll tag on my question, which ties into what you were talking about. First one is on the affirmative action bill and why feminists and gender advocates are not as visible in promoting it and joining that campaign, and what can be done differently. And my second question has to do with thinking about the new approaches. What else can we do differently to A, help raise awareness on what feminism is and isn't, B, make feminism in Ghana more inclusive and not necessarily based on privilege, and then finally, any other point you would like to add to that? So who would like to take the first question, and then you'll all answer the last one?
About the affirmative action.
Yes.
I'm not sure why, except to say perhaps they don't think that marches make a difference when people are not listening. It doesn't matter whether it's a march for affirmative action or not. And also because we do have some people who don't think affirmative action is the way to go. And it's always contentious. And that's because they don't understand the nature of why it is that the status quo is the way it is. It's not, it is, and how to address it. So part of my answer to the last question would be, we really do need affirmative action. We can tell from the Barometer statistics that some sort of affirmative action is needed to correct a historical wrong. Because if you pretend that we operate in an environment that creates equal opportunities, you are joking. Because it doesn't. It doesn't for males and females, and it doesn't actually, we're seeing it for even social demographic groups. So people are now talking about the fact that there's a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. It's because we pretend, but we are equal now, so you all go to school, you all do well in your exam, you all get to, no. So the privileged will always have the privilege because they have access to the resources and the power in order to always be on top. And that's the problem with the male-female gap and imbalance. So you're right, we need to educate people more. We shouldn't assume that it's self-evident, and maybe that's part of the problem. We think it's self-evident to people that we need affirmative action. Maybe we need to do a bit more sensitization and find ways of letting people get it. You know, I remember, and here's my personal anecdote, and I'll turn it over. Many years ago, because I'm not a spring chicken anymore, when there was a columnist who wrote a satirical column in which he wrote about me. Anybody who knew me would recognize that he was satirizing me because I'd had a child. And said, I want to meet the man who was able to almost like tame her in order for her to have a child. And of course, friends called, teased me, blah, blah, blah. I didn't really say anything. I didn't do much about it. I'm like, this guy is just an ignorant fool. However, patience. One day, we happened later on to be on a show together. And typically would go and we would read the newspapers and then we'll go and argue, you know, on television, you know, the sort of thing that your mother would have disapproved of her daughter doing. You know, but anyway, so this particular item had something about affirmative action or women's equality. And one of the guys says, but women, what do you want? The laws, and this is important, the laws in this country don't discriminate. So what is it that women are fighting for? And I turned to him and said, you know what we're fighting for? To change the attitudes that don't make the laws, that will give life, proper life to the laws. You don't know me from Adam. You don't know that I'm a difficult girlfriend, wife. You don't know that. You think you have a right to have children because you're a male, but you think I don't have a right to have children because I'm doing exactly what you do. You're a journalist, I'm a journalist. We sit on radio and debate issues. So what is it about me that you think, therefore, disqualifies me? Then he turned, and that was my moment of triumph. He says, I'm so ashamed. I didn't see it in that way. So then I gave them a little discussion about it's the attitudes that make it difficult. So like, and it comes back to what you said about the Senegalese. If you think you'll be ostracized from society for asserting your rights, then you have to weigh and decide that, well, I don't want to lose that much. And so the final word is, what should we do? We need to work harder to change attitudes. Because, yes, most of the laws are there, but we need to change attitudes in order for us to achieve real gender equality and empowerment for women.
Thank you very much. Great, Kobi. So what can we do? New approaches and ideas in that respect.
I think I'm remembering. I'll bring up my mother again. There's a particular conversation that we had once, and I remember it because I think it may be the only conversation I had with my mother that I won. And it was where she was saying that the problem is men, specifically fathers. Fathers need to do a better job of educating their sons. And I think what I told her is that, so let me get this straight, Mom. You are saying that for equality to be achieved, we need to wait for men with the attitudes that we currently have to miraculously raise our boys in a different way. And she said, okay. And the thing was that our fathers, and I can speak in terms of like the home that I come from, the family that I come from, our fathers literally come from a different time. And so a lot is going on that they don't understand. And so I think that from the perspective of a man, it's kind of like the fathers are learning almost at the same speed as the sons in this very rapidly changing world. And there's a deficit there as well that needs to be addressed. So in terms of things that need to change, one thing that I would say is just a spotlight on stories. And perhaps this is where the media comes in. It's also where social media comes in. It's where traditional media comes in. I think we need to tell a lot more stories of people who are doing things the right way. I think those stories need to really saturate the media space. So from, again, a man's perspective, it will be about fathers who are getting it right, fathers who are raising their sons in particular ways, raising their daughters in particular ways, mothers who are raising their sons in particular ways, mothers who are raising their sons in particular ways.
Let me inject a little pushback on that.
Okay.
Not saying I don't agree, but something that came up. This question of women being visible in the media. Right. So as we're telling these stories, most times, I think you brought it up, and it's been brought up a few times, most times when women are going to talk about some of these issues, they get a pushback, unless they're only talking about fashion or makeup or beauty. But when they want to talk about telling politics or saying, you know what, maybe men need to be socialized different. I can just imagine a woman saying that and the news headlines and what is going to happen to her the following day, right? So just inject that into what you're saying.
So I'm saying exactly the same thing. I feel like, so when I walked in here, for example, one of the first things that I noticed is I was very curious as to what the turnout would be, who would be here. And then I looked around and it was mostly women, and I said, who you are. I think that men in the media space need to definitely hold those positions and say them without fear of pushback from other men because we have that privilege. And then also, when our fellow women journalists are making those points, we should back them up. Until we reach a point where our women journalists are making those points and they don't need to be supported, it just becomes a thing about humans making a point. But we're not there yet. And so at the moment, I feel like that's the reason why I make it a point in my spaces to make these particular points, because otherwise a woman might make the point and get shut down. And that's the privilege that I have. And so the trick with privilege is acknowledge it and then share it. And I think those of us who have it in whatever form, whether it's our privileged positions as men, as heterosexuals, as middle/upper class, we need to apply those things. And the stories thing doesn't just apply with regards to good stories of fatherhood, etc., but just stories of feminist work that is being done, because not all feminist work is described as feminist work. And so if the work that people are doing is framed in a particular way that people understand, oh, this is what it's about, it helps us all. And I think the relationship, just last point, between Ghana has a particular relationship between the analog space and the digital space. And so I think people in the digital space keep on doing what you're doing, but do so knowing that eventually what is in the digital space, it doesn't stay there, it spills over. I worked as a journalist at Joy FM, and I know that the journalist who will walk in who doesn't have a story, the first place that they're going to look is online. You see, and so and that means that by the afternoon, someone who doesn't have access to the internet will be hearing that through a radio out in wherever. And so there's a relationship between these things that we should be mindful of, and we should just push out stories of the work that is actually being done, whatever it looks like. Yeah.
Awesome. So, Amma?
I'm not sure where to start from, but so I'd like to say this on the point about raising the voice. I always make this joke. I talk so much about men, boys, feminists, and then I've always wanted daughters. I told God, I want daughters, women, and then I have 2 boys now. And so I said, it's God's way of telling me that, okay, raise them the way you want them to be. So, yeah. So I'm trying, but I mean, they are not without their challenges. So I have a nanny, a wonderful one, who, if my first boy, he's 3 now, he likes playing in the kitchen with pans, pots, anything. Then nanny will say, oh, we are Bema, we are then with Jade. And I quickly have to go, Mani Jano. So, I mean, with all the brilliant ideas about raising him to be very aware, like Prof. Gajepo said, there are always these challenges. I'm not sure if I'm not at home, the sort of things, probably pull him from the kitchen to go and play football or do something else anyway, but we trod on, we'll get there. So about the new approaches, what to do, and I would frame this from a social media, because that's where I realized, as much as in the last, let's say 2 years, since 2016, I was talkative on social media, anything feminist, anything gender, you find me there. And it was good. When Pepper Dem started, the awareness on gender was huge. I mean, in traditional media, everywhere, we're going everywhere to talk about gender. So I love that. I think it was brilliant, the sort of things that online advocacy brought about. But personally, I mean, I have sat back now and, like Kobe was saying, there has to be that connection. Because anything that's been done online. So I think in my first year when I started teaching at the university, I was trying to find a way, I do pharmacy, health, to sort of do research that will capture that and gender. So my very first undergraduate student, I said, we have to do something about gender and health. And she said, hey, people will say I'm feminist and my work. She started complaining. I said, no, we'll do it. And I supervised her for a year. And at the final presentation, this girl was being asked questions. I was sitting back and saying, oh my God, is she going to answer? She did so brilliantly. I actually walked out of the hall to clap for her because I just didn't want anybody to see my excitement. I was like, where did she learn these things from? People were asking her questions and she was giving answers. I am not sure I would have even said these things. Fantastic. She did her research and dedicated it to the women of Ghana, wrote a brilliant dedication to them. I was like, okay, that's one person converted. So, I think and also we have to raise the awareness. Like you're saying, we have to. I think these affirmative actions, I've never really engaged, but you have to make as much noise as possible. At some point, we can't help but have to listen and then be a part of it. So I think with social media, with traditional media, let's just talk. The conversations are going on. Let's continue. Let's make sure gender is on the agenda. People are talking about gender. And then, yeah.
I think one thing that I like to do, typically in restaurants, because it's very subtle, but whenever the bill comes, it's so interesting. Whenever well, as you can see, I'm not the only one. So whenever the bill comes, the waiter or the waitress. No, I'm waiting for the room to go quiet. Okay, so whenever the bill comes, clearly there are lots of bill stories. So, Kobe, we need to do a series on that. But whenever the bill comes, the waiter or waitress will automatically, always, without fail, give it to the man, right? And I mean, yeah, chivalry, or you can couch it in whatever argument you want to. But what I do now is whenever that happens, so long as I'm in a good mood and there's time, I'll always call the waiter or the waitress and say, for all you know, he could be my little brother who is in school and I am treating him. So the best way to go with this is just put it in the middle on the table. Whoever wants to pick up the bill can pick it up. It also becomes very awkward. Like, don't make it awkward for people, right? So that's one thing that I always try to do in a very subtle way, because we come with our own perceptions and stereotypes about what the situation could be. You're looking at me. I feel like you want to say something.
I do want to say something just in defense of waiters, though.
Okay.
Because I'd imagine sometimes it can be very stressful for the waiter. And I'd imagine that the waiter is, okay, so maybe the default is that, and then you might just be the one troublesome person who they know that, oh God, is that one? Okay, so this one, let me put it in the middle. But I do think you're right in the sense that, like, if more people were doing it, yes, but then we should also think about the waiter.
I'm not sure. But that's exactly it, right? Because at the end of the day, nobody told this waiter, which is why I make it a point to just highlight it. Because the other thing that happens, and I've heard this from men, is that if they have, for example, a business partner who is Caucasian, they give it to the Caucasian, even if she's a woman. Yeah. Right. So a lot of it is just like stereotypes, social conditioning. Yeah. Okay.
So it boils down to power, and we didn't use that word enough in this room. Yeah. But it's the power dynamics between men and women, inequalities, and now you've just talked about the perceived power.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so we still have some time, so don't worry. I knew that we'll need time at the end to talk. I just want to read some more submissions on social media. So Amma, they're saying thank you. Araba is saying thank you for highlighting the question of privilege and sexual minorities and differing approaches to feminism. And also your point about activism serving the end goal. What is the end goal? Kobe, someone is asking about another wave of feminism. Please, we already talked about that in the beginning. But you can send a question, and I'm sure we can get it to whoever you want to get it to. Just leave your comment on the video, and we'll try and get it to them directly so they can respond. The obsession with seeing women in subservient roles is real. That's Rashida. A question here. Prof earlier alluded to the fact that we appear to be doing well in terms of getting women in appointed political positions, but not so well in elective positions. What is the most effective way of addressing that? So that's a question for you. And then Ifwa is talking about the question of gender roles, especially in marriage, and how it contributes to the marriage crisis. So basically what Kobe was touching on. One person did say that it's also important to highlight the fact that not all feminists hate men, and not all men who critique feminism hate women. So that I thought that was an interesting.
Hate women at all? Did any
No, they're talking in general terms.
But does any feminist
No,
hate
but
men?
that's why it's a difficult framing for me.
Yes.
Not all feminists hate men, as though feminists should hate men.
Yes. So he's saying that that is the perception, but that is not the case. So that's what he was just highlighting. Yeah, I think that is it for now. So we have one question for the professor, and then final question in the audience. Okay, good. We're good.
Let me come back to the simple answer is if we want to change the equation at elected political office, then we have to engage with affirmative action. There's almost no other way I can see. And that's because of the nature of how politics is. And you do remember that many years ago, or maybe not too long ago, but many years ago now, the NPP party, it wasn't in power then, wanted to do affirmative action at the level of their primaries. And that's the only way it will work. If at the level of the parties, the political culture allows for mechanisms that would build up women. And one of those mechanisms is affirmative action. So what did the NPP say? Let us have women in safe seats, and let us make sure that where there's a woman, don't contest against her. There was an uproar. And they retracted because people do not like to give up their privilege. And therefore, if you need to do affirmative action, we need to do a lot of work because people don't give up privilege easily. And I felt a bit sad that not only did the NPP not come back to that issue at all, but other political parties have not engaged it as well. And I wish that we had political laws, for example, that would mandate certain equality. You see, what do I mean? The political law in the country says you have to be a national party. You can't be a regional party, right? So we should have a political law that mandates you to be more inclusive of women, one. Two, or perhaps, as many feminists have argued, have a political system that allows for women. So the quota system, rather than a system where it's first past the post and competitive and nobody wants to concede. The men already have the power, they don't want to concede it. So that's the problem.
Okay, thank you very much for breaking that down. Final question. This is a big one. Do we all have to be feminists in order to achieve gender equality? You need time, man.
I don't need time.
Well, if you define feminism as broadly as we have, if you want change in your society, if you want social justice, if you want a Ghana that maximizes all its human resources in a just manner, then yes, we all should be feminists.
Okay. Kobe?
A certain person who once walked Galilee, he would answer questions with questions. And I'm going to do the same thing. My response to that is, why wouldn't you want to be a feminist?
Typical Ghana response, eh?
That's a big one. Should we all be feminist? Okay, so I'm going to break your question into two. Should we all be feminist? Yes. That's the ideal. Should we all be feminist before gender equality can be achieved? I don't think so. I don't think so. We will get there. It might probably take us longer, but we will. if we don't have everybody being feminist. But
What
We should
about
all
the
be
audience?
optimists.
So what about the audience? How many people think we should all be feminists if we want to achieve gender equality? By show of hands. How many of us think we should all be feminists if we want to achieve gender equality? By show of hands, okay. And how many of us don't think we have to be feminists to achieve gender equality?
not necessarily. Not necessarily.
Okay. Okay, so maybe this is the question that we should take home and guys, we're almost done. We're almost done. I know, right? And this is exactly the question that person that you want to talk to, start the engagement with them with this question, okay? But before we leave, just 3 takeaways. The first one is the need to spotlight the work being done, whether it is in the digital space or at the grassroots or in between. The second one is about feminists being more representative and inclusive, and all of us being okay with the fact that not everybody might be at the same level of understanding and that it's a process. The third one is the importance of raising awareness in our own spaces and more generally across the country. And yeah, so that's it for today. I'm sure you have a lot to talk about. Please do not forget to check out the Afrobarometer report. I'm not sure exactly, is it published online yet? Afrobarometer.org. You can definitely take a look at that and take the conversation to other places.